So anyway, mercantilism as the philosophy or the ideas, the national and economic ideas emerged, where the wealth of the nation is the health of the nation. Sorry, the health of the nation is the wealth of the nation, opposite to what we say. If you wanted your country to be healthy, it had to be wealthy. And wealth increasingly measured in gold and bullion and trade surplus. The ideal of self-sufficiency. Countries should be self-sufficient. That wasn't new. The ancient Greeks had that. As far as possible, don't be dependent. Don't have to pay others. Keep it in the country. Keep it in the city. Keep it in your own group. That became a driving force. To do that, you had to increase agriculture and wherever and however exploit natural resources. And in those days, all natural resources were viewed as infinite. Self-sufficiency, build your population. The more people, the more powerful your country was. In some of the European countries, if you had 10 children, you were exempt from tax. The Spanish, if you had 7 sons, remember now you're making soldiers for the king. You, the father of the 7 sons, were ennobled, like someone's called Sir so-and-so. You became Don Juan, Don so-and-so. You were actually ennobled if you could produce 7 sons, even though you'd be a lowly peasant. And then colonies. Countries needed colonies to take the surplus population, to give land and living space, to create new estates, new wealth, new agriculture. The colonies were to exist for the benefit of the mother country. They weren't hypocritical about this. They said it. This was the philosophy of the age. The colonies were to be established to exist for the good of the mother country, to produce raw materials and commodities that the mother country needed cheaply, and to buy manufactured goods and import manufactured trade goods, which would in turn enrich and keep the balance of bullion growing in the mother country, and to help with defense, and so forth. Many, many other little nuances, but that was the driving force of the age. And I'm talking now about the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s. And everything that happened after that in our history fits into this driving philosophy. And then you have to think about the colonists. Some came as impoverished sons of noble families. In the case of the Spanish and the Portuguese, they had been fighting the Moors in a savage war which made them cruel, because they learned cruelty from the Moors. They crucified 20,000 Spanish soldiers when they took Toledo the first time. They had been fighting. They had a superabundance of men, of adventurers, especially the hidalgos, these younger sons of nobility, desperate for money, desperate for land, desperate to cut out and make their own haciendas or plantations, so forth. But then you had poor people, vast numbers of landless poor people, and it applied to all of them, Spain, Portugal, England, France, who wanted a new life, to get away from being a tenant farmer or a serf, and to have the chance to own land and have a family and to seek their fortune in a new world. And you had holy men of God. We tend to only think of the bad, but there were good men. If you read the history of Brazil, there was a war with the Guarani 100 years before the background of the movie The Mission. where they expelled the Jesuits and finished enslaving the Guarani. And the Guarani defeated the Portuguese, and the Guarani army was trained by the Jesuits. There were holy men who were on the side of natives and who were there to do other things. Where there was a chance to conquer and get quick gold and silver and so forth, soldiers gleefully did it. That's what soldiers went to war for, to gather booty and come home rich and buy their estate and so forth. But the main drive was land and settlement. Columbus started the settlement on Hispaniola on his second voyage, if you don't count the ones he left on the first voyage. Sugar was brought to Hispaniola on the second voyage from Spain. He knew about sugar growing from Madeira and from the Canary Islands. And it's astonishing. Puerto Rico was settled in 1508. Jamaica in 1509, this is the Spanish. Cuba 1511. And then of course the Pope had divided the New World and set a boundary, so the Portuguese got Brazil, and in 1530 they started their colonization and they introduced sugar. And back to all the colonists, they were landing on a occupied or unoccupied shore. There were natives to fight. There were natives to catch and enslave because they needed labor, part of the morality of the times. They needed food. They needed clothes. They needed weapons. They desperately needed things from the mother country, and they cost money. And so from the very beginning, there was a desperate quest, besides the greater mercantilist idea. The idea was once they get there, they'll settle in, they'll start clearing land, they'll start growing things and become productive, which eventually happened everywhere. But there was a desperate need for things, commodities which could be exported. And why I started with sugar was because sugar was such a precious thing in Europe. The Crusaders had brought it west after they came back from the Crusades, and for a while it was really treated as a spice. It was a luxury of the rich and famous, of royalty practically. But as more and more sugar was produced in the southern world, with trade with the Arabs, and then in Spain and Portugal they took it up, Madeira, the Canary Islands, they started using African slaves in the Canary Islands and the Azores. It was a precious, priceless commodity. And so they went into it with a vengeance. And there's something that we ignore, something we don't all know about, not even fully known yet. But if you read books like 1491 or Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jarrod, not all the Indians. When I was a boy, we were taught in school that the Lucayans were all taken from here to Hispaniola to work in the mines where they died from the rigors of the forced labor. It seems that more and more science historians and researchers turning up that the Europeans inadvertently, no one went around with germ warfare in mind, but inadvertently populations of Europe have been exposed to smallpox and measles and influenza and things like that for thousands of years. The Amerindians had not. And so there's a whole science to antibodies and immunities and resistance to disease, but Cortez could not have conquered the Aztecs if they hadn't been devastated by smallpox. The same thing with the Incas. They would have wiped out the Spanish, but they were totally devastated by a tremendous plague of smallpox. It took out like 2/3 of their population. In New England, the whole coast from Nova Scotia to Rhode Island was depopulated by smallpox. And everywhere the Spanish, when De Soto went into Florida, he carried 300 hogs in cart cages. And they bred, and they were fed, and they were butchered as the army marched. And some got out, and influenza and animals cross-fertilize each other, and it's believed that swine flu ravaged the Indian populations of North America everywhere, and even ahead of where De Soto went. And so in many cases, the colonists were there trying to establish haciendas, having to clear forests, create fields, plant sugar, plant other crops for food and so forth, and no labor. And that's where African slavery comes in. Even the priests said, these Indians are dying out. It's not gonna work. You're gonna need to use African slaves. And so the Spanish were bringing them into Hispaniola and then to all their colonies right from the beginning. Portugal, which controlled the slave trading coast at the sea level. The slaves themselves were taken by Arabs from the interior and by African chiefs, and the trade happened in the different forts that the Portuguese set up. And between the two of them, African slaves started pouring into the New World. And that's where mercantilism started to work. Portuguese plantations became huge gold mines, and the Cuban, and the Hispaniola, and the Puerto Rico, the Jamaica, later Trinidad, huge gold mines of sugar production. And the other Western Europeans, as I said, they had their unfinished civil wars and their religious wars later on, but as England, Holland, France also became their strong nation states, they were not to be left out, and the mercantilist philosophy was there with them as well, and so they wanted colonies, and so the list goes on. Jamestown, Bermuda, 1623 St. Kitts, which got shared with the French within 2 years for a while, 1627 Barbados, 1632 Antigua, the Dutch colonized Tortola in 1612, 1634 Curacao and Aruba, the French, St. Kitts 1625, Guadeloupe and Martinique 1635, 1650 St. Lucia, and then came war. 1655, Cromwell took Jamaica from the Spanish, made it a British colony, and 1672 the Danes got into the act. And so you have this establishment of colonies, production of commodities, and larger and larger numbers of slaves. The sugar so valuable, and it bends down and doesn't die in a hurricane, which will destroy all your fruit trees, all your vegetables, all your food crops, but the sugar bends and then it comes back up, which we forget in this modern age. And so the people who were producing this valuable sugar commodity, they started to have money, but they needed goods. And so, guns, clothes, food, codfish from New England started pouring down into the West Indies. And still, ackee and codfish is still so West Indian, so Jamaican. People don't even remember the cod comes from the northern cold waters. And then, at the same time, I should have maybe talked about rum earlier. Every culture from the time of the cavemen made some kind of intoxicating liquor. And The African slaves brought knowledge of fermentation and how to make alcoholic beverages, and so did the Amerindians. And in Brazil, which is where it really started, when they had the sugar manufacturing, the big copper cauldrons, and they would boil them, and then there would be a crust, a dirty crust left at the bottom, would be left out in the rain, it would fill up, it would ferment, and found to be good to drink. The slave masters initially encouraged the Africans to drink it and use it because it gave them calories and more strength to work in the fields. But then they desperately needed commodities, and every seaman that ever came to bring men, equipment, commodities, or to pick up sugar and so forth, wanted to get drunk. And so there was a market, and so rum also became a part of sugar. Rum, molasses, hard crystal sugar, that started driving the economic engines of the New World. And then think of all the other commodities that flowed from it. The Indians knew how to make chocolate from cacao. That was introduced to the New World. Chocolate is a vile and bitter thing without sugar, so that increased the use of sugar. Coffee was introduced from the New World to the Old World. A few months ago when Godfrey Eneas lectured, he talked about the Columbian exchange, all the exchange of crops and commodities that help each other. Well, these all ended up growing and growing and growing into huge economic engines, but at the core of it was sugar, and the backbone of sugar was slavery. But nevertheless, as I said, we are reporting history, not judging it, and it went on and on and on. Then the English